Odysseus leaves the House of Death with a renewed sense of purpose for getting home, but still has flawed methods for doing so. Hello and welcome back. My name is Zachary May, and today we are reading the great books of Western civilization together, continuing with the Odyssey. This is the Robert Fagles translation, Book 12, and we will begin with a brief plot summary. Odysseus and his crew sail back across the ocean river and arrive at Circe's island once again. They hold the funeral for their comrade, Elpenor, out near their ship. Circe and her handmaids appear bringing food and drink, and she urges them to stay for the next day in order to prepare for their long journey home. While the men eat and rest, Circe asks Odysseus to tell her what happened in the House of Death. Once he does, she explains what he will face on his journey. First, he will pass the island of the Sirens, whose voices entrance those who hear them such that they throw themselves overboard to their deaths. Next, he will sail through a pass between two cliffs, with Scylla on one side and Charybdis on the other. Scylla is a six-headed monster that will try to eat his men. Charybdis appears as a whirlpool that 3 times a day sucks down all that comes near, and also 3 times a day vomits it back up again. Scylla will eat at most 6 men, Circe says, but Charybdis could destroy the entire ship, so Circe urges him to move his ship closer to Scylla's cliff. Lastly, they will come to the island of Thrinacia, where the sun god's cattle graze. At this point, they will have the deadly choice that Tiresias spoke of, to do them no harm and go home safely, or to do them wrong and share in a grisly fate. Dawn arrives, and Odysseus sails away with his crew. As the ship nears the island of the Sirens, Odysseus shares Circe's revelations, with a few edits. He uses beeswax to stop their ears so that they will not hear the song, and asks them to tie him to the mast so that he will hear it without plunging to his death. As soon as Odysseus hears the song, he begs to be released, but his shipmates only tie him down tighter. They release him once this first danger is past. Next, the ship makes its way towards the pass between Scylla and Charybdis. Odysseus did not tell his men about Scylla, in fear that they would all shrink from the decks, not row, and she would get more of them. However, he brings out his own armor and weapons, ready to fight her off himself. Not seeing her, though, his eyes, as well as those of his crew, are drawn towards the whirlpool of Charybdis, and so, unseen, Scylla makes her approach, and snatches up 6 men before anyone, including Odysseus, can react. The ship passes on, though. Odysseus explains the prophecy of Tiresias to his men, and the cattle of the sun that it concerns. He orders that they skip the island of Thrinacia completely, and sail through the night, without stopping. Eurylochus opposes this openly, citing the weariness and hunger of the crew, as well as the risk of being hit by a cyclone in the dead of night. Odysseus yields, but asks that the men swear an oath not to harm the cattle. They do so, and so they dock the ship at the island. That night, a storm comes upon the ship. Odysseus urges the men not to be afraid, for they have plenty of rations in the ship. There is no need to get onto the island. However, the storms continue without stopping for an entire month, and slowly but surely, the rations are all eaten. The men begin to fish and hunt on the island, still avoiding the cattle, but not getting their fill of food. Odysseus ventures inland to pray to the gods to save them, to make the storms go away so that they can continue their sailing home. He falls asleep as he prays. While he is asleep, Eurylochus urges the crew to join him in slaughtering the sun god's cattle. They'll make it up to him later. They'll build a temple on Ithaca, he says. He goes on to say that even if they do get killed for this by the god's wrath, that it will be much better to be killed all at once at sea in a storm than to die slowly of hunger here on the island. The men roar assent, and they get to it. They drive off and slaughter the cattle, burning part of it as a sacrifice to the gods. Odysseus awakens and smells the meat, crying out in anguish to Zeus over what he knows has happened. The nymphs that herd the cattle immediately report the offense to Helios on Olympus, who then asks that Zeus punish the crew as was foretold. Zeus assents. Or, so Odysseus was told anyway, later, by Calypso. He was not on Olympus to hear the conversation. Odysseus begins to berate his men, but knows that there's no way to make it right. Behind them, the cattle's hides begin to move, and the meat on the spits begins to moo. Undeterred and unbothered, the crew continues to eat them for another week before sailing away. As prophesied, once they get out to sea, a great storm comes upon them, and Zeus strikes the ship with a thunderbolt, causing all of the crew to perish except for Odysseus, who manages to float away on the mast of the ship. He floats for days until he finally washes up on Ogygia, the home of the nymph Calypso. His story ends. The men were terrified. Oar blades flew from their grip, clattering down to splash in the vessel's wash. I strode down the decks to rouse my crewmen, halting beside each one with a bracing, winning word. Friends, we're hardly strangers at meeting danger, and this danger is no worse than what we faced when Cyclops penned us up in his vaulted cave with crushing force. But even from there, my courage, my presence of mind, and tactics saved us all. And we will live to remember this someday, I have no doubt. Up now, follow my orders, all of us work as one. No mention of Scylla, for fear the men would panic. Trust me, he says to his men. I can help you. I can save you. Odysseus has a lot of confidence in himself, and thinks that his crew should too. Over the course of this book of the Odyssey, however, he learns that this is a mistake. He's not as powerful as he first believed himself to be, nor is he the only free agent on the ship. When Odysseus returns to Circe, she describes in detail what will happen to him when he passes the land of the Sirens, those creatures who spellbind any man alive, whoever comes their way. Whoever draws too close, off guard, and catches the Sirens' voices in the air, no sailing home for him. No wife rising to meet him, no happy children beaming up at their father's face. The high, thrilling song of the Sirens will transfix him. Stop your shipmates' ears so none can hear, none of the crew. But if you are bent on hearing, have them tie you hand and foot, so you can hear the Siren's song to your heart's content. If he is bent on hearing. He doesn't have to, it isn't necessary, but he chooses to. Testing his will, perhaps. Or it's just so beautiful and it's a nice experience. And how alluring their song is. Come closer, famous Odysseus, Achaea's pride and glory. Moor your ship on our coast so you can hear our song. We know all the pains that the Greeks and Trojans once endured on the spreading plain of Troy when the gods willed it so. All that comes to pass on the fertile earth, we know it all. Bernard Knox gives us some insight into what is so alluring about this. It isn't the singing, it's what is offered. Odysseus is a veteran. He is on his way back to a society in which a new generation has grown up in peace. There will be no one to understand him if he talks about the war. That is the strength of the Siren's appeal. We know. But of course, the Siren song is an invitation to live in the past, and that is a kind of death. Remember Achilles' death in Book 24 of the Iliad as well, also caused by a kind of reliving the past ad nauseum. This appeal to Odysseus' desire to be known is something that we already knew he was vulnerable to, though. Circe uses similar words in convincing him and the crew to stay with her. Well I know what pains you bore on the swarming sea, what punishment you endured. But once they pass the Sirens, the spell is broken. Odysseus took a risk, and it was only by the strength of the crew's knots that he didn't pay the price for it. It was a reckless test of his will, but also symbolic of a transition between looking toward the past and looking forward to the future. Recall that in Phaeacia, his past sickens him, fills him with grief. He talks about it unwillingly and takes every opportunity to reorient his discussion towards the future, toward going home. Even when angered and insulted at the day of games, he only briefly alludes to the fact that he might have been at Troy. Certainly not enough for Alcinous, to be sure. Circe also warns Odysseus of the pass between Scylla and Charybdis, and the choice that he must make between them. He asks her if he could avoid losing any men at all by fighting her off himself. Yes, but tell me the truth now, goddess, I protested. Deadly Charybdis, can't I possibly cut and run from her, and still fight Scylla off when Scylla strikes my men? She replies, So stubborn, the lovely goddess countered. Hell-bent yet again on battle and feats of arms? Can't you bow to the deathless gods themselves? Scylla's no mortal, she's an immortal devastation. And yet, he tries anyway. But now I cleared my mind of Circe's orders, cramping my style, urging me not to arm at all. I donned my heroic armor, seized long spears in both my hands, and marched out on the half-deck. He thinks he has a chance. He really thinks he does. By himself, I might add, for he tells no one about Scylla. It's true that if the men panicked and stopped rowing, as Odysseus feared, The monster would have easily eaten far more than 6 men. But he could have at least told a few. Maybe a dozen of his best, like the ones he took to fight the Cyclops. Those are the ones that get eaten anyway. Why not give him a fighting chance? In any case, Odysseus' overconfidence in his strength is challenged. For not only does he not even get a chance to use his weapons and watch them not work, he is forced to stand and watch, helpless, as he sees their hands and feet already hoisted, flailing, higher, over my head, wailing down at me, comrades riven in agony, shrieking out my name for one last time, flinging their arms toward me. Of all the pitiful things I've had to witness, suffering, searching out the pathways of the sea, this wrenched my heart the most. Odysseus acknowledges now that he is not as strong, as powerful as he thought he was. We see this as the ship approaches the last danger, the island of the cattle of the sun, for he makes no attempt to test his willpower. He urges his men to skip the island completely, row straight past, and give no opportunity for temptation to assert itself. But giving that order in and of itself is a test of resolve, one that he fails. So I said, and the warnings broke their hearts. But Eurylochus waded in at once, with mutiny on his mind. You're a hard man, Odysseus. Your fighting spirit's stronger than ours. Your stamina never fails. You must be made of iron from head to foot. Look, your crew's half dead with labor, starved for sleep. Drained as we are, you'd have us desert this haven? Out of the night come winds that shatter vessels. How can a man escape his headlong death if suddenly, out of nowhere, a cyclone hits? Let's give way. Sit tight by our swift ship, and then at daybreak, board and launch her. Make for open sea. So Eurylochus urged, and shipmates cheered. So I let fly with an anxious plea. Eurylochus, I'm one against all. The upper hand is yours. But swear me a binding oath. Doesn't matter. He gives in. He is not as strong in will as his men seem to believe. Even at the risk of mutiny, Odysseus had cause to hold firm. Remember, he had the prophecy. If they left the cattle alone, they would all live. They would all make it home. And if not, only Odysseus would survive. Once he agrees to stop, though, one thing leads to another. Odysseus bears some responsibility for what happens to his ship and his shipmates. He takes too many risks that rely on his strength alone for success. However, his men bear ample responsibility as well. Notice that Odysseus does not tell them what is going to happen if they eat the cattle, and yet they seem to know and accept those consequences anyway. Eurylochus opened up his fatal plan to friends. Listen to me. All ways of dying are hateful, but to die of hunger, starve to death, that's the worst of all. If the sun, inflamed for his longhorn cattle, means to wreck our ship and the other gods pitch in, I'd rather die at sea, with one deep gulp of death, than die by inches on this desolate island here. They definitely chose their own fate. And ironically enough, Eurylochus expresses now that he would have been just fine with dying in a wreck to escape hunger, even though that was the very thing he said he wanted to avoid to begin with. There's a lesson about temptation here. Again, if you don't say no to whatever it is at the start, before it has a chance to work on you, it becomes much, much harder to avoid. The person avoiding fast food who decides to go to McDonald's just to get some tap water has already lost. This is interesting though, because in most stories in Greek mythology where there's some sort of fate, horrible fate that the character is trying to avoid, it's their attempt to avoid that fate that inadvertently and unintentionally causes it. However, Eurylochus' declaration is very willful, very resolved. He acknowledges the consequences openly and chooses it anyway. Free will and the agency of the person making the choice is emphasized here. And even after Eurylochus makes his choice, we see absolutely no remorse from him or the crew members. Once they put the meat on the spits, it starts moving. The meat starts mooing at them. If it was me, that would have been the time that I would start begging for mercy. It doesn't bother them at all. They just go on eating for another week. No remorse. They don't care. They're sticking with it. I think it might also be the origin of the phrase sacred cows, but if you guys know of where that is actually from and I'm wrong, please tell me in the comments. And unfortunately, it is not just Eurylochus and the crew that are punished for their decision. It is Odysseus too, for he loses 7 years of his life. But maybe if Odysseus had shared more of the truth with his crew and stood with them in solidarity, joined his strength to theirs, asked for help for the earlier dangers, maybe they would have joined theirs to his and trusted him more for the last one. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like it, subscribe to the channel, and comment below and let me know what you liked the most. See you next time.